Watch this. No way!
Hello and welcome back to the Cookie Jar Golf Podcast. I am Tom Mills and today I'm joined by Bruce Fitzpatrick.
Hello.
And author and historian Roger McStravick. Roger, welcome.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
For those of you that don't know, Roger is a world famous historian and an author, and he's written books such as The Road Wars and In the Footsteps of Old Tom. He's got extensive works on the history of golf and specifically St. Andrews, which is why we've pulled him on to the podcast today. And Roger, I think let's start off with, what got you into the history of golf?
David Joy. It's simple as that. I went to see David Joy, and it was Peter Allis meets Old Tom Morris show at the Bar Theatre. And I went to see Peter Allis because I was a huge fan of Peter Allis and wanted to hear all his funny stories and stuff. And I didn't know anything about Old Tom Morris. But Old Tom came on first, and I was like, oh, all right, here we go. Because I wanted Peter to come on first. But the more David talked, the more I got into it and gripped. And then especially that scene with Tommy, losing his wife and child, and then dying himself on Christmas morning. I was, I was Halle Berry on Oscar night. I was just in floods of tears, and it just resonated so strongly with me that I wanted to know more, and I started researching and finding out, so that's the house where they lived, and the house where Tommy ran down North Street, and Reverend Boyd was at the doorstep, and he got that terrible news, and it was just like I was living in this theater. This, every street had some sort of dramatic element, and it just from there just grew and grew, and I found during the research. I found out more and more and found out new stuff about Tom Morris people didn't know before. And it just grew and grew, but it all comes back to, that David Joy, show. David is a lovely guy, lives in St. Andrews, amazing actor, and I've seen him do the show umpteen times, and I always weep at the poignant parts, so, even though I've seen it a million times, but it just resonated with me, really, it really did.
Were you always into history, and then it just and then the old Tom Morris stuff sort of presented itself, or did that spark your interest in history altogether?
In school, I was scathing about history. I thought, why do I want to know about that? I want to know about, things of the future, and I did ancient history, bizarrely, at A level, and that was fantastic because you learned about Caligula, and the madness. And
oh, don't embarrass me. I don't know any of this stuff.
Oh, the Roman emperors.
Emperors. Come on, Tom.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry. I thought everybody knows Caligula. Just the wonderful, the Caesars and all that. So that was all really interesting, so, but I don't know why, it honestly, if somebody had told me back then, oh, you're going to be a golf historian and you're going to specialize in St. Andrews, I would have said that eating the wrong mushroom on the golf course, but I love it with a passion, honestly, and I'm now editor of Through the Green, the British Golf Collectors Society magazine. So every day I'm looking at golf history and editing people's articles and helping to get them online, on track. I don't know why, but it absolutely resonates with me, and I think my wife does not know why either. So, if I start a sentence with, "I think you'll find this interesting," you can guarantee that she won't find it interesting.
I think that's just the thing with all wives, isn't it? They don't find anything interesting that we like. I think it's part of the job description.
My wife's a psychologist, so I know the signs now of when to continue a conversation.
And when the eyes start misting over a little bit, yeah. Yeah.
When her head hits the table, I think, that's enough.
But yeah, I guess on a slightly more serious note, the great thing that I think you pointed out there in terms of seeing the David Joy show, and also in your book, In the Footsteps of Old Tom, is that with St Andrews, even in the present day, you still can get a real good sense of the history of the place and maybe what it would have been like to live in this town back in the day. Because I think, am I right in saying a lot of the architecture is broadly similar? I mean, a lot of the key landmarks are still there. Obviously, the university is one of the oldest in the world, and I guess even going back to before the story of golf, which is synonymous with St Andrews, I guess what St Andrews is perhaps best known for now, but there's a great kind of religious history and a religious significance to the town of St Andrews. And obviously you've still got these landmarks like the kind of cathedral and the castle ruins. And it's brilliant that you can walk around it now and still maybe get a sense of it. As you were saying, the story of young Tommy running down North Street there, and some of the sort of plaques or stones that have these hugely important moments sort of etched into them, so that it's pretty accessible actually to anyone walking around the town now.
It is completely, it is exactly, the three street structure is there. The house Tom lived in is there. The house that Tommy's wife passed away in, is still there. All of these houses and the backdrop to the developments of golf in the 1800s were there, are there, it is quite remarkable how the whole of St Andrews seems like a movie set, really. So much drama, so many open champions, on every street. In the graveyard, if you go to Alan Robertson's obelisk, and to the left of him, within 15 feet, is Jimmy Anderson, who won 3 Opens. To the right is Willie Ochterlony, who won the Open Championship. And then still to the right, there's Tommy, and then there's Tom. That's 12 Opens, within touching distance. And there's people who won the US Open as well, buried there. So, but the whole of St Andrews, and that's what is so fantastic about it, is that you don't really have to use your imagination very much. You can just walk across and, round by the 18th green, there's Tom Morris's shop. There's the window he hung out of when they had that photo. There's a photograph of Tom hanging out the window. So it is remarkable, and it is lovely, because, usually when you go to start places, you have to imagine what the building would have been like and what the street would have been like. Very little has changed in that sense. The course is always being updated and refined, the links course, the old course in particular, but not much. By much, and the course that Tom played in the later part of his life is pretty much the course that we play now. So, I love it for that. So,
It's a very strange place. I mean, Bruce has obviously spent a lot of time in St Andrews, but I went for the first time, I think, October last year. And I don't think there's a feeling like turning down Golf Place for the first time and seeing the RNA clubhouse, and then then the old course is sort of approaching you on the left, and you look at it, and it's just, I still get goosebumps thinking about it now. It's such an incredible feeling when you go there, isn't it? It's really something else.
It is, honestly, and I hope I never lose that feeling. Although I've been there, a lot of times. I still get that feeling. You come around the corner, the anticipation, and it's just magical, really, because you just walk, and if you're just standing behind the 18th green, but there's Seve holding his putt, there's Bobby Jones, being carried off the green, it is just magical, and then towards the first tee, and there's Eisenhower, he actually walked the first hole, to be fair. Do you know that story?
No.
So I'll just share with it. It's slightly, it's in the local paper. It said, Eisenhower, General Eisenhower at that point, this great, American general, he said, please watch him on the 1st and 18th hole, but please leave him to enjoy his round, and enjoy his golf. So the crowd started out and thousands of people, and Eisenhower came to the first tee, and he basically thought, I don't want to play this.
Oh, no.
So he walked the first hole, So if you see the photographs of Eisenhower, you'll see they're all laughing. But that is that he actually walked the first hole, But it is intimidating,
absolutely.
That tee shot and even the summer must have been really intimidating because there were so many people doing staycations and staying at home, but it was good weather. So there were like so many people around that first tee watching people, hit the shot of their lives in front of these crowds, So it must have been terrifying for them.
It's an odd one, isn't it? Because you find that wherever you go on St Andrews, whenever you're there, there's always a crowd watching the first tee. Like whoever, it doesn't matter who's teeing off. There's always a crowd there.
Yeah. But it just. But even if you're watching the golfer, you do feel this. There's something that just hits you in the solar plexus. It's just wonderful. Because there is so much history and it's so vivid, Queen Victoria's son, Duke of Albany, there's photographs of him teeing off, in the spot you're teeing off from, there's the Prince of Wales, there's photographs as well. It's just, so special.
I remember being a student in my final year of my undergrad and going up and playing Crail on a morning. I'm guessing it would have been May or June time. And then just seeing on Instagram, my Instagram stories, all my friends were posting pictures of Obama literally coming in the day he came to play. And I was like, I can't believe I've missed that. But obviously they kept it, quite rightly so, because he just left, I guess he just left office at that point. He was maybe 6 months removed from being president. And I guess they had the whole sort of Secret Service detail and whatnot. But thousands and thousands of people watching him come down the 18th, and kind of speaking to students or like my fellow kind of students who just finished university about their time there and what it was like playing the old course. And it is just sound like a broken record, but it is just incredible how many different people, not just great golfers and great champions in our sport, but also the fact that, like, the idea that a president who has just finished his 8-year term wants to go over to St Andrews and play the old course is quite a funny thought.
That was a special day, and my wife was a fan of Obama. And we were literally we had just left the roundabout, the roundabout as you leave St Andrews, and my friend had sent me a message saying Obama's about to play the links. So this was before he had teed off, but we had an appointment in Dundee. But honestly, we nearly cancelled the appointment.
Really?
I did a U-turn on that road to go back, But it is. But it is special, It's not the longest course, but the history is incredible, And I love it, and it is my favorite course because it's not a long course, but you need to learn a lot about it, So it's just a special place all around. It's like the full package.
Absolutely, and it has got this incredible depth of history, which is, I suppose, why we've got you on. So we've been fairly light and breezy. Let's get into the heavy stuff. I mean, what do we know about golf and how it started, certainly around the St Andrews part? What are we actually, what can we prove? What are we aware of in St Andrews?
So the game of golf that we play is a Scottish game, the long form of golf, the Royal game. It's been played in Scotland. There's no smoking gun. There's no point in history, that we can go, that's the point, and that's when it was invented and stuff like that. But there are some historical details. I guess in 1552, well, actually, no, before that, I think about the the Jameses Act, I think it was James I in 1424, had banned football, but he hadn't banned golf. But in 1457, the second James II, banned football and golf. So we know that somewhere the current thinking is, and this may change, as all historians are open to change, that we think is somewhere between that window of 1424 and 1457 is when it first started to be played on such a scale that the king had to say, you need to practice your archery because, the English are coming, that sort of thing. So, and this is wasting their time doing, frivolous pursuits like football and golf. But the first mention in St Andrews that we've found so far, and that's a fairly large caveat, was 1552, which was the Archbishop John Hamilton, his charter. Well, it's actually not a charter; it's an agreement between himself and the people, and it does say that people are free to play golf down on the links. But the truth about that agreement was that what he wanted was the revenue from the rabbit pellets. So the pelts, sorry. So basically, it's a letter to himself, giving himself lots of revenue, but also the people are free to use this land as they like, because they played football on the links as well in the early days. So they played football on the links right up to the 1800s. There was a letter from John White Melville that I came across of him complaining that played football on the links, and that was actually doing serious damage to it. So we don't have to go back too far to understand that this was the common land, and this is where they bleached their linen, they dried their clothes, the linen sheets. The cattle were allowed to roam. They played football on the links, and obviously, and they played golf. It's just that golf became the dominant factor, really.
And would golf? And this sounds like a stupid question. I'm sorry.
No, go for it.
Would golf be a sport that I would recognise? Is it kind of similar to today?
Yeah, no, absolutely. You're hitting a long ball over a long distance into a hole. It's as simple as that. The street golf as well, which used to play around the church arch, and that's really good fun. There's a French company called 19th Hole, and they do it in Paris. And it's really cool. They play like from the Eiffel Tower to like something on the street, a lamppost,
really?
And they design a course, and people have to go out at night and play this course, and they play with a special ball, so if it hits a car, it's not doing any damage, But it is wonderful.
The hole itself was standardized at a later date. So what did they use for a hole then? Or did they was just an arbitrary size? How was
it? Was a hole in the ground, that they created. The keeper of the green would have created a hole in the ground, but it literally is a hole in the ground, and you take the sand from the bottom of the hole. If you were a nervous putter, I would say you would aim to go out later in the day, because the hole's just going to get bigger and bigger. Yeah. So, but yeah. So, and there was number of theories about when did it standardize and who put in the first tin cup. Tom Morris certainly claimed that he put the first. He got a blacksmith to make a ring, and then that would hold the hole in shape. But yeah, no, but it's definitely a game we would recognize. The one fundamental difference, and hopefully this will give some solace to people who play with hybrids. Their set of clubs would have looked like a bag of hybrids,
Really?
Right.
all sort of these long neck clubs. So the hybrid is probably closer to the original game using hybrids than irons. Irons come in at cliques, as they were called, but came in at a later date.
Oh, right.
But yeah, no. So Tommy Morris's locker was opened in sort of 1899. It was sort of 25 years after he had died, and it hadn't been touched since then. And I saw this photograph relatively recently. but there's no bag. There's just the clubs. So because they didn't have bags in those days, the caddy carried the clubs under his arm. And they're all wooden clubs, apart from, I think there was one sort of lofted club, which looked like, a mashy niblick, and the putter as well. So and that's relatively, so that's into 1870s, 1875, 74. So the clubs were different, slightly different back then, but not massively different. And then they sort of evolved to what we know now.
And I guess another key point on the equipment side of things is the feathery ball is the most popular. I mean, that's the ball that's probably been played with for the longest period of time, I guess, in the history of our game. Am I right in thinking that was quite an expensive, almost barrier to entry, really, playing with a feathery ball because of how long it took to make them? And people, I mean, there's even stories, I think, of people trying to steal them with some kind of contraption that would come down the sort of trouser leg or something to try and steal from other people on the links. But I don't know if that's true.
I haven't heard that. I love that idea, though. Somebody walking with a very stiff leg.
Yeah, kind of the reverse Gary Player story, almost, or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. So no, I haven't heard that, but that is wonderful. So they could make about 3 in a day. 3 or 4 in a day, and they were difficult to make because 3 pieces of leather, and then stuffed with goose feathers. A top hat full of goose feathers, how they used to describe it, and they were compressed in, and then they had to be hand sewn as well. And sometimes they were rolled, but sometimes they had more similarity to an egg than they did to a golf ball. Sometimes they were kind of misshapen, But yeah, and when it rained, they got impossible to play with because the leather obviously got heavy. It was like, I don't remember the old leather footballs, but in the rain, and growing up in the 80s, they became so hard to give it a good kick, So again, the golf ball would have been harder to manage, which makes the gutty ball such a revolution, really, It comes in and it's much cheaper, much easier to make, can be made with molds, can be made in mass numbers, But I putted with a feathery just last year, and honestly, it felt amazing. It was like a balada ball, like a really soft feeling, and to put with it was just majestic, And then I put it with an original gutty ball, and it was like putting with a snooker ball.
Really?
This gutta percha had been rolled hard, and honestly, it was just joyless, really. But the thing is, it just was an easier ball to make, a cheaper ball to make, and more people could afford it. So it just had so many things going for it. And then they realized, obviously, when they put a little nick in the ball, that it spun more. So then that's when they started doing, hammering them, to give them some sort of grooves, which has evolved, obviously, to the dimples we have today. But yeah, no, the feathery ball is just a beautiful ball to play with, And we were talking earlier before we started about President's Day next week for the British Golf Collectors Society at Royal Liverpool. But and I'm playing with some hickories there. But to be honest, the clubs that I would love to play with is a sort of replica set of Tommy's clubs. These are the clubs that Tom won the Opens with. It's just what Willie Park used, it's what Tom used, it's what Tommy used, and also I think I'd do better with the set of long woods.
The hybrids, gentleman's persuader, or whatever they call them.
Exactly, because the cleeks, the early cleeks are barely a razor blade, and there's a microscopic sweet spot, So I'd love to if anyone's listening who makes clubs, please consider doing that, you know, because nobody's done it. Nobody's made a replica set of Tommy Morris's clubs or
Really?
Tom
right.
Morris. Yeah.
Yeah, we hear a lot about, I guess, Bobby Jones's replica set and obviously Calamity Jane, but it's crazy to think no one's made a replica set of Tommy Morris's, given, you know, how well, yeah, he was the greatest player of his generation, undoubtedly, and obviously winning those 3 Opens in succession and basically retiring the champion belt for, a year or so, or forevermore, I guess, and causing the Open to skip a year in being played. It definitely seems something that's worthwhile doing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So if anybody is going to make those, I'll test them out for you.
Roger will test them out.
And then lose them. I'm sorry.
I mean, going back to St. Andrews a little bit, the whole place has evolved quite considerably, hasn't it? I mean, how did the course evolve in that time? Because I know originally it was 22 holes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. How did it all happen?
So it was 22 holes to begin with. And the holes were located very similar to the course that we play on, for want of a better description, today. The final hole was probably in, I'm trying to give you a guesstimate. So the Tom Morris shop, if you imagine the garden of the Tom Morris shop, that's where the final hole originally was, because that was all part of the course at that point. There was no houses. But at some point in time, the course moved over to where it is now, the 18th hole to where it is now. But the original 22 holes, so the first holes were deemed to be too short. And the thinking at the moment is that the first hole would have went from the 18th green, because, you know, they play the same holes out and back in those days. The front 9 hadn't been created. So they're hitting from the 18th green to about where Russax is, you know, about 200 yards away. And then their second hole would have been to the 17th. And then the 17th itself would have been divided in 2. So the third hole probably up to the corner of the dike, logically thinking. And then the fourth hole would have been to the 16th green. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So there were 4 short holes. And in 1764, the Society of St. Andrews Golfers decided to, and that was the original, what would be the RNA, they decided to cut those down into longer holes. So therefore, instead of 4 holes, you had 2 holes, you know, and then it's out and back. So, you know, they've effectively lost 4 holes. But what an amazing first hole that would have been, you know. So the first hole, to describe it, you have to imagine that the first hole is beach. The first hole, as we know it today, is all beachland. So the fairway is 65 yards wide at its narrowest. So they have to tee off from around, you know, from 2 or 3 yards, 2 yards from the 18th hole. That would have been the first tee. And they have to drive down, miss the water's all on the right, the beach is on the right. They have to miss that. The Halkett's bunker is there by Russax as well, so they have to miss that. Then they have to get over the burn, and then they have the Rotal bunker to the, you know, beside the 17th green. Oh, what an incredible first hole! You know, for today it would be amazing. Never mind, you know, with your wooden hickory clubs, you know, hitting the ball about 200 yards, you know. So yeah, it was a lovely course, and I got to play the course in reverse 2 years ago, and it was amazing. It was amazing to see bunkers come back to life and in play.
Yeah.
It's a great tradition, isn't it? I think it seems to me that the Links Trust are hosting that kind of reverse playing of the old course a few times a year now, when it previously hadn't been done for a few decades by the sounds of things. But it seems like a really, really cool thing to do, seeing all those bunkers that I guess when you play it in its current configuration, the normal configuration, they wouldn't really seem to be in play. But, you know, I'm thinking particularly of the 12th, you know, playing to the 11th green there, you're like, it's just a totally different challenge and must be such fun. I've not done it, but I can imagine it would be incredible.
No, honestly, it is, you know, and I was lucky to play with Scott McPherson, who's also an author and a golf course architect, and Gordon McKee, who's, you know, superintendent of the links. And we had such fun playing it. And Fergus Bissett as well. It was a lovely four-ball from Golf Monthly. But yeah, it was amazing. I think, yeah, and we all played half decent. We all had I think we all had 3 birdies or 4 birdies each. So it was like it was a good game, you know.
Yeah.
Scott, to his credit, was dressed like Old Tom and had a bag of hickories, you know, and he still had 3 birdies. Yeah, you know. So
that's awesome.
It was lovely, but you know, to play this course in reverse, that Old Tom knew very well, and to have, you know, Scott there in his refinery was just fantastic. You know.
It's we've just we were lucky enough to do some filming at St Andrews, which you were kind enough to donate some of your time when we interviewed you for, and that's going to be released in accompaniment to this podcast. While doing that filming, and certainly the aerial filming around about sunrise and sunset, and you start to see the dapple and the land, you really realize, and I mean, when you look down the first and 18th holes, it becomes acutely aware that the right hand side, the 18th side of it, is all dappled and rumpled land, and the first side of it is completely flat. You know, completely flat. It's unbelievable. And then only when you do the research, like you said, that used to be beach, and that's been built up over time, that it's so incongruent with the rest of the course, I suppose, because it's pretty much the only flat bit of land on the whole course, isn't it?
It is, absolutely, you know, and they were worried they were going to lose the course, and so that's what they so what they did, and it worked really well because the town was undergoing this massive revolution of building and development in the 1800s, early 1800s, 1830s or so. So they took all the rubble and stuff from building foundations and whatnot and dumped it on the beach and leveled it off. So that's why it's like a billiard table, because it's all reclaimed land. And then that was added to again and again, you know. So, and that's why professionals aim to play up the left if they're teeing off the 18th, because they'll get a flat lie, where you might hit your best drive down the 18th, but you could end up with, you know, 1 foot up in the air and 1 foot down, and you know, and this sort of thing, and or a terrible downhill lie or something, you know. So, so that's the trick to the 18th. But it is all reclaimed land, you know. The whole landscape I find fascinating around, especially like underneath the 18th green. There's a colour pit, you know. If you're playing up the 18th, and it would be the far right of the green where it sort of raises. That's where the cholera pit is, you know. So,
wow, it's unbelievable.
Yeah, it is, absolutely. Well, it happened when Old Tom was making the green, because it was a tiny little green. And you'll see photographs, you know, from 1857 when people are putting on the green, and it's a tiny little thing. But Tom created this beautiful plateaued green, you know, and it's a really clever green because you look at it and it looks flat as a billiard table again. But if you stand by the steps of the R&A, it's, you know, it's severely slanted. So you should aim up the right-hand side and your ball will always feed back down to the hole if you're playing that hole. But when he was building the green, the workers came across this cholera pit, you know, this pit of bones, and they were a superstitious lot. You know, 150 years previous, they were throwing witches off the cliffs at the scores to see if they would float and were made of wood, and if they did, then they were whisked up and burnt as a witch. That was the thinking at the time, which doesn't really stand up right now, you know. And then if you died, then you had the good grace, you were with God, albeit a bit earlier than planned. But yeah, so these guys were superstitious, and And they put down their tools, and then Tom said, if you want to get paid, given that with the poor law and stuff like that, there weren't many opportunities to make money. And if you didn't make money, then there was severe consequences. So, but the guys picked up their tools, finished the job, and Thomas said on record that it was the thing he's most proud of, because it is a wonderful closing green, and there's an optical illusion there. And 9 out of 10 times when people hit it the first time, they'll end up short. It's so hard to convince yourself to hit, a 7-iron when you think you're a wedge in. It's a beautiful green. But that whole landscape, come back to the point, that whole landscape I just find utterly fascinating.
And just lingering on old Tom for a little bit longer, am I right in thinking he's credited with a lot of that work to the front 9, really, in establishing almost a sort of a separate set of 9 holes that moved away from the traditional kind of playing the same holes out and back that you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So there was, if you imagine that the front 9 we play now was all covered in gorse and wind, and he basically dug that all up, and which opened up the front 9 fairways as we know it. So Tom is absolutely credited for the front 9, and the greens, the double greens, they can only be expanded sideways because. Which is why they're a lozenge shape, just because the Eden estuary, so there was limited land in one direction, so you had to go in another direction. So all the double greens are fairly lozenge shape. They all add up bizarrely to the number 18, it was old Tom who did that work. He created the first green, he created that as well. The 18th green, as I said, he did that and created the front 9. So when people get quite angry about any changes, you have to see it in the history of the course. It has been constantly evolving, and old Tom certainly never thought that he couldn't make any changes. You think the changes that he did make were fairly drastic, because the traditions would have been out and back.
Yeah, and it would have played that way for, presumably, it would have been played as an out and back for a few hundred years by that point, perhaps. Certainly a couple of hundred. Absolutely.
No, completely. And he didn't think, well, I can't touch this. He thought, well, I can improve this. And that's that is an old Tom thing. Even people said that when he designed courses, he went out in the morning and walked the course, knocked a couple of pegs in, and then went out, had lunch, and came back in the afternoon and played it. And that's just mythical nonsense. He was constantly coming back and refining and refining and refining. And it is wonderful what he did. There's no howler in there, really.
Yeah.
Is there any evidence historically why they decided to make these sort of enormous double greens, or was it because it's not, I suppose, looking at it from a modern day point of view, there would be no reason to. They could have separate greens. Is there any sort of evidence why they did what they did?
You've got to think of it at the time it was at, and golf was expanding. The train line has opened up the whole of the country. Train line is bringing tourism into these coastal towns that really didn't have it. The golf ball has become cheaper. So the numbers playing the courses has completely exploded, really. So you couldn't have them going back and forth to the same hole, Even in 1876, I think where Davy Strath got into difficulty opening because he hit a guy on the green, It just was that, again, everything evolves, really, and it really had to evolve, out of necessity, so that people could play, and then the demand comes such that actually we need another course, so then they start creating the new course, But it just was the popularity of the game, really. It was nothing to do with anything aesthetic. It was purely functional. People needed people to play golf and not have to wait, all the time, really.
Yeah.
So
I suppose they looked at it in terms of we've always played to the same green, so let's just make the green bigger. Yeah, maybe,
absolutely.
That's what they've done with.
And at that point, because of the Eden estuary, they couldn't expand them from back to front. They had to go side to side, because if it would have been eaten into the land, that would have been the tee box or the fairway, So they had to, necessity again, I don't think there's one element that Tom didn't reassess, think, how can we improve this? How can we make it better? Which was why I think he really was known as a grand old man of golf because of that, from the caddy side of things, he was a caddy as a boy, to being a player, he was the best in the world, and then designing courses, he designed over 100 courses or redesigned some courses as well. So he really was seen as this wealth of knowledge, which I think is why they had so much respect for him in his later years, and had his photograph taken with royalty and stuff, so he just was a remarkable man, and you could, and that's why myself and so many others are constantly researching and writing and finding new bits and pieces of information,
I think from what we've sort of learned, just, in creating this film on St Andrews, is it seems that the game was maybe limited to just a few Scottish coastal towns in the early days. And it's just quite an incredible story, whether through sort of fate or serendipity, or perhaps really the influence of figures like Old Tom and Alan Robertson and Hugh Lyon Playfair. St Andrews ends up becoming really the epicenter of golf, and is obviously now quite rightly known as the home of golf. And yet that never, I guess back in the 1800s at least, that probably wasn't always so assured. There's arguably courses that might be a little bit older, and the Honourable Company of Edinburgh Golfers were the first to establish a competition and some kind of rules to the game. And then Prestwick presides over the first sort of 12 Open Championships, but it's St Andrews that ends up becoming the kind of epicenter really of the game. I mean, do you think, is it as a result of people like Playfair and Morris and these people who are kind of doing so much to grow the game and redevelop parts of St Andrews that had perhaps fallen into a bit of decay and disrepair? Or what do you think is the sort of story as to why this town in particular becomes synonymous with the game of golf? So
Hugh Lyon Playfair is to St Andrews what Tom Morris was to the Links. So he was working for the East India Company. He was had a career in sort of engineering and getting projects done. So when there seemed to be a lot of barriers, in India you got telegraph poles built across vast distances when that would have been very hard to organize, create, make happen. So he was a guy who was very good at getting things done. And it's just what St Andrews needed. You have to think St Andrews was called decrepit. From the summer of 1559, when John Knox gave his infamous speech in the Holy Trinity Church about idols and false idols, and the locals were so incensed they went out and completely obviously forgetting about Jesus and burnt down cathedrals and in town, and Jesus had clearly left the building at that point, but they went out and they destroyed the cathedral and destroyed the monasteries, and you have to think at that point in time, St Andrews was the wealthiest place because it was the epicenter of the church, with the largest cathedral and all economies and all jobs that spring from that, But after the Reformation, the town just falls into decay. And that's 1559 right through to early 1800s, and it was called decrepit. It was just a ruined town with no jobs really, There would have been golf, but I'm not sure. There would have been livelihoods. There were ball makers, definitely. So there must have been some caddies as well. But then Playfair comes back, and he says this could be the metropolis of golf, and so that's good places for people to stay, good golf course, good accommodation, but the housing also made to like the new town in Edinburgh, the standards there. So he foresees a massive revolution. Whether he foresaw what we are today, which is just amazing, but he just wanted it to be the perfect place for golf because it had those elements, So, and he started working on it. People thought, he had lost his mind, really. Thought this was absurd, but he did it. He forced things through when he wanted things done. So South Street, as we know it now, is a lovely wide boulevard. It's almost French-like because the width of it. But in his time, there were houses that jutted out onto the street all the way along, and he managed to get rid of them all because he wanted uniform lines. And the most famous one was the Principal's Nose. And that's where we get the Principal's Nose from, because in the Principal's house, Principal Haldane had a house, but it had a porch that jutted out onto the street. And there's lovely poetry in the 1800s saying, "Ere the Principal's nose he means to cut off." But the Principal's nose was this porch, this house that jutted out onto the street, But he completely, it was a complete revolution. But also what he did, he empowered people to think about their area. It's what can you do for your town, sort of thing. It was that sort of almost JFK type thing. And the locals did, and they ran with this, And he did. This new housing was just absolutely beautiful housing, where middle classes could live, middle classes could visit and stay. But this is all Playfair, So we owe so much to that man. The train line.
I was going to say, yeah, train line was something that he was hugely influential in as well, just overcoming some of the obstacles there. And I guess that ultimately is something that makes St Andrews a more attractive kind of residential, but also holiday resort for that Victorian age. Absolutely. And and I really do admire his can-do spirit. Nowadays in St Andrews, as it is probably with everywhere, if you want to add a porch to your house, you need to spend about 6 weeks trying to get through planning permission, or but he seemed to be able to get things done. And sometimes he even bought houses because people wouldn't make the changes he wanted, so he just bought the house from them and made the changes he wanted. Wow. So just an incredible man. I know Edward Playfair has written a book on this, and he's very proud of his ancestors, and he'd be a lovely guy for you to have on the show. He is so knowledgeable about the Playfair family. Oh.
I mean, it's so strange, isn't it, how these inflection points happen in history? Because, I mean, arguably, if not for Playfair, we wouldn't have St Andrews as it is now. We wouldn't have Old Tom Morris, but maybe golf would be in a completely different place that it is today, if not for, an ambitious entrepreneur, really.
Who loved golf, I guess, as well. I mean, am I right in thinking he's quite important in the money match format, really developing because I guess there's more money coming back into St Andrews now, and then you've got professionals like Robertson and Morris as well who want to play in these entertaining money matches. And I guess Playfair, he's a member of the R&A as too, which kind of has a bit of a affinity or connection with the Union Club, and it's just it's so lucky that he is such a keen golfer.
Yeah, and half decent golfer as well, But yeah, every part of St Andrews, and he also helped with the links, and he was all very much about presentation. So So, for example, behind the 18th green, there's a terrace or a path there with benches on it where you can sit. That was Playfair. That didn't used to be there. That used to be all undulating land like the Himalayas, and he was the one that leveled off the path so people could watch. And when the links originally went to the doors of Tom Morris' shop and Jimmy Anderson's house, when it originally went to the doors, he had benches down the side of the links as well. So he completely transformed that into from a sort of fairly rough landscape into a place where Victorians, genteel historian or Victorians could sit and watch and come and have a promenade as well. Victorians loved a promenade, so they were there with their parasols and stuff like that, and that was Playfair, So in addition to completely cleaning up and transforming the town from a rundown town into a place, an attractive place to live and visit and play. He also helped with the links as well, Granny Clark's Wynd, as well, tarmacking that straight across, There was just so many things that he was able to get through because he was town provost as well, So, but in those days, it was a lot easier, really, than it was than nowadays. If you try to,
much less red tape, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. You say you want to tarmac a road through the links, you would have all sorts of horror and, but anyway, great man. Great man.
Moving into the 20th century, I guess the links maybe had a slightly complicated ownership in that it was sold by the council back in the early 18th or late 18th century to the Dempster family in the end, and then James Cheap bought it off them. And then it seems at the end of the 20th century, or so the end of the 19th century, golf has grown to be such an important game to the townspeople that the Links Trust is essentially established. How does that kind of development continue and St Andrews and golf's evolution continue into the 20th century?
So the links always had, although it had different owners, there was always a right of the people to play golf over the links. And even when it was sold in 1797 by the town council because they were, struggling with debts, it still had that clause in it that said the golf must not be, interfered with in any way, and that maintained through all the various sales and stuff until it was bought back for the town in the late 1800s, and it's been that way ever since. But it is, and I think some of your listeners may not understand this, that it was the people's land. It was common land. And was for a very, very long time, and my research at the moment is around 1124, and it's still, common land, so it goes back a long way, that right of the people to use the land, because there was lots of changes of ownership of various parts of land, but that right for the common land has always maintained with the people of St Andrews, and it's still that atmosphere today, and the St Andrews Golf Club, it's very much feels that it is the people's land, and it's been managed by the Links Trust on behalf of the people, and it feels like that locally, So, but the Links Trust, so it was taken over and bought back for to come back under public ownership, and it is wonderful. It is an amazing site, and I think Playfair would be more than delighted with what the Links Trust are doing.
And I suppose this is going to be difficult for you to remark about succinctly because you've written a whole book about it. But the road was a big issue as well, wasn't it? the bringing into of the road to the links. Tell us a little bit about that.
So the book, The Road Wars, is about the road outside the Tom Morris shop. But the thing I find fascinating about when researching was when I came across statements of Old Tom being cross-examined in court. And I couldn't believe what I was reading, because instead of, you hear Tom Morris did this and Tom Morris did that. Well, this is Tom Morris speaking, unedited. And it was just amazing. And he revealed so many secrets about his life that we didn't know about, and could only guess. He actually started working as an apprentice for Tom Morris, or for Alan Robertson, when he was 18. And I really uncomfortable saying the word apprentice, because he was 18 years old, and Alan Robertson was only 6 years older than him. So, so the problem with the road war in particular was that the houses had just been built facing the links, but the golf course went right up to their door. And what they wanted was a road so they could get carts down to deliver coal, etc. And the town council wanted to let them do it and build it on their own dime. But the one town councillor thought this was sacrilegious. He was new to the town, but he thought this was, how dare you put a road through the links, which is pretty reasonable proposition, and he disagreed with his fellow town councillors, and so much so that he took the council to court, on a point of law. Nobody was going to prison, but they wanted the courts to decide, could they proceed with allowing this road to be built? And so it was fascinating. There's cross-examining court, and it would make a fantastic movie. Jimmy Anderson is there being cross-examined, Dow Anderson, all these greats of St Andrews, John White Melville, all these legends are being cross-examined, but in their cross-examination, they're telling the story of St Andrews, and their earliest memories. So, but in the end, the road is built, and it's quite farcical, because there's decisions being made saying the road can be built, so they start building the road, and then there's an appeal in. So the road, there's two teams of workers. One's building the road, and one's dismantling the road at the same time.
Oh no!
Yeah, and then and they actually got. I'm quite reluctant to make this sound stereotypical, but they got a lot of Irish workers in, from the docks to come and help finish the road. But what they did was, in Granny Clark's Wind, they plied them with drink, which meant the other team could crack on and get the road finished. Which is just, national stereotypes, no lie. I hate this movie. But yeah, so it was quite farcical. But they did eventually get the road down, and then the road went once down, and also the law was behind them as well. It's dead, But it was a wonderful time researching. I honestly would still be researching it now if I could, really.
If you didn't have a deadline.
That is an incredible story. Yeah. So that's obviously a fascinating story there, Roger, and one that I guess hasn't really been told before prior to your book. What other projects are you working on as far as St Andrews is concerned? Any other kind of big books or works in the pipeline? Yeah,
this is a big one. Alan Robertson, a friend, Bill Williams, came to St Andrews and said he wanted to write a book on Alan Robertson. And I thought, fantastic, this is wonderful. And we had a meeting, and he had a few meetings in town, and I think he had felt that some of the people he had met were fairly disparaging about him, and that there's nothing left to be found, which is the most idiotic point to take as an historian. And I met him afterwards, and I said, listen, just if you can see this book and, and you visualize this book and you can see this book and you can see something nobody else can, you write this book, And so we kept in touch, and he was supposed to come back in June or so. And he said, so he was a little bit unwell, but he would come back when he could. And then it popped up on Facebook that Billy Williams had died. It was pancreatic cancer. Which knocked me sideways. And then I met his daughter and her husband at the Fairmont, and she brought over a load of papers and said, would you consider finishing this book? So it's a real honor, to do this. Bill had done some amazing research. It's probably about a third of the way through. I think he's written about 30,000 words. So it is wonderful, and there's a completely new Alan Robertson emerging, and not emerging in any sort of sensationalist way. It's from the cold facts of what he did, what he played, and what people said about him. He found a lot more statements when people discussing Alan Robertson, people who had met him, and the word kind gets used, which was never used by Alan Robertson. He was always portrayed as a sort of a vainglorious guy,
kind of austere bloke. Yeah,
he did gamesmanship. He would ask his caddy for a club two clubs stronger than what he needed. But that was their language for give me something 2 clubs less than what I've asked for, and they won matches and stuff like that, or he won matches, he won a lot of matches, clearly. But he was the champion golfer, and it's because of him, we have that title today that's announced at every Open Championship. When he died, it left that open question: who is the new champion golfer? And then that's why, the RNA will announce the champion golfer of the year is, and all thanks to Alan Robertson. So it's a wonderful book. I'm not sure if I'll get it finished by this Open, but I just rather get the right book rather than trying to squeeze it into a crowded field, because there's a lot of brilliant books coming up. I know Mungo Park has a new book coming out on Willie Park, and that'll be wonderful to hear that story for the first time.
Definitely.
It's exciting to work on.
Absolutely, and it clearly means a lot to you. You can tell, and it's a sad story, but I'm sure that you'll make a fantastic fist of the book, and we really look forward to being able to read that when it gets published. Roger, thank you so much for giving up your time to us today. You've been absolutely brilliant, and it's always good to deep dive into things that I don't know much about, trying to learn by proxy. But thank you very, very much for your time, and really appreciate you coming on the podcast.
Not at all. Good to speak to you.
Watch this.